This video is going to be the first of two videos on the equation of a circle, and we're going to start with the very basic. And if you look at the equation right here, that this h and the k stand for the center coordinate, and the r is the radius of the circle. So that's your basic equation that we're going to use, and that's what we always want our answer to look like if we have to write the equation. So next, if we're given the center and we're given the radius, that means that the h is the -2 and the k is the 5. So when we set this up, this is the beginning setup that you're always going to use. So now if I want to use my center coordinate, my -2 goes in for the x parentheses, my 5 goes in for the y parentheses, and my radius is the last part that needs to be squared. Now if you notice, some of these things need to be adjusted. So this first parentheses, if we have minus a negative, becomes a +2. The y will just stay y minus 5. And then when we square the 3, we end up with a 9. So this would be our final equation after we simplify everything. If you notice inside the parentheses that the signs of the x and the y values are always going to be the opposite of what they are for the center coordinate. So you might want to make a note of that on your notes. In number 2 now I want you to set this up, and I want you to write down what is the center coordinate going to be from our equation and what is your radius going to be for your circle as well. Since this is x minus 6, that means it was really x minus, and then the 6 is the coordinate part of it, so that's our x value. If this was y, that's supposed to be y, so that's y minus a -3, then that means that our -3 is our y value for that coordinate. And then your center, your radius, this has already been r squared, so you need to take the square root of 49 to solve for the radius. Our radius would be 7, so there's your final answer. This next section is kind of a refresher on factoring perfect square trinomials because we need to understand this before we go down to the completing the square. So when we factor a trinomial, we are trying to get two factors, so in parentheses, that if we multiply them, that'll give us this trinomial. A perfect square trinomial means that those two factors, or two parentheses, will be identical to each other. This is how you can check to see if there is a perfect square trinomial. You want to check if you can take the square root of the c value, which the c value is this last constant in your basic equation for a trinomial. You need to take so you take the square root of that number, and then that answer you're going to double it, so multiply it by 2. And if that is your b value, then that means that your trinomial is a perfect square trinomial, so your two factors are identical. So if you look at number 3, if we take the square root of 25, that gives us a 5, and then if we multiply that by 2, we get a 10, which is our b value. So that means this is a perfect square trinomial, which means we can factor it. So we're going to set up our two parentheses. It's always x and x, and so those are the variables we have. And then your square root of 25, so this 5 right here, is always going to be this last number. And whatever the sign is right here in the middle will be the same for both of them. So we're going to have x plus 5, x plus 5. But for our purposes, we're going to write this as x plus 5 quantity squared. So that's how we're going to always write our perfect square trinomials. That's how we need to write it later on in these notes. So for number 4, we're going to do the same thing. We take the square root of 16, we get 4. Then we can multiply by 2, and we get 8. And yes, that is the same number of our b value, so it does work. When we write our two factors then, I want you to fill in what you think the two parentheses should be. What you should have put in is this 4 is the part that goes in our parentheses, and this sign in the middle, since it's a minus, will be for both of them. So that's what you should have written. But now together would be x minus 4 quantity squared, since we have two of the same identical parentheses and same factors. All right, so here's a refresher on the completing the square, because I know some of the algebra classes last year went through this at the end of the school year. And completing the square, basically, you want to make your trinomial that it is not a perfect square trinomial. We're going to make it so that it is. So the way to do that is we need to add a c value, so a new c value, onto both sides of our equation so that we're able to factor that new trinomial, and it will make it a perfect square trinomial. So this is your equation that you're going to use to find out what that new c value is, so that it will end up working out like we did in these last two, where it will be a perfect square trinomial. That's the end goal. So if it doesn't come out that way, then you have to go back and rework that c-value to find the correct one. So in number 5, we're just going to go and find what the c-value is, and then we're going to factor it also. So your first step is you're going to take the b value of our equation, so that's this -6. We are dividing it by 2, and we are squaring it. So that's what our equation up here is telling us to do. Take the b value divided by 2 and then square it. So -6 divided by 2 is a -3. But when I square it, it becomes a +9 is my c. Now if I'm adding a number onto one side of my equation, to keep it a balanced equation, I have to do it on the other side. So you're always going to see the same number being put on both sides, but the left side is really the one that we are looking at, and that's how we are determining what that number is going to be. This is just kind of we have to put the exact same thing on the other side. Now, once we filled in what the c-value is, we can factor this left-hand side just like we did up here in 3 and 4. If we check like we did in 3 and 4, if we take the square root of 9, we get 3. And then if we multiply that by 2, we get the 6. And notice that that does make this a perfect square trinomial. So we can factor it just like we did in 3 and 4. So you always want to check that. Then for my two factors, we've got x and x. And then the square root of the 9 is my 3. So that's the number that's going in here for both of them. The sign in the middle for the b is my minus sign. So this would be x minus 3 quantity squared for the left side. Now remember, we've got an equal sign we're carrying down all the way across, and we need to combine these two values together, so that is going to be 12 on the other side. So instead of it just being the factored part, you're going to have it equal to a number. We're going to use that in the next set of notes to help you find the equation of a circle, and we're going to need that number because that's technically going to be the radius afterwards. But right now it's not the radius because we don't have a circle equation. This is just kind of half of the equation, and that's it. All right, so now sometimes the equation that you are given to begin with is not, they have this extra c value here. So in number 5, we didn't have that c value, we just had a number already on the other side. So what we need to do is first check, is this a perfect square trinomial, like we did in 3 and 4? So if we take the square root of 15, which is about 3.8, when we multiply that by 2, we get 7.75. So that does not equal the b value in the middle. So it's not a perfect square trinomial. Because it is not a perfect square trinomial, that means that we need to move this constant to the other side of the equation, this extra 15. So to move that over, we need to add it to the other side. So we're going to have x squared plus 20x, I'll leave a little space there, equals, and then my 15. The reason I left that little space is just like up here, we need to fill in what our new c value is going to be. So I usually put a little line to show me that I need to add what that new number is going to be, and that's my c value that I need to find now based on my b. So my b value, remember, is the 20. So our new c value, we're going to take the 20 divided by 2 and square it. So always divided by 2 and always square it. 20 divided by 2 is 10. Squaring that, then we get a 100. So 100 goes automatically in those two spaces because I always have to do it to both sides of the equation. And a lot of times if you don't leave a little blank space there on both sides, you're going to forget to add the 100 to the other side, and you might only put it on one side. So before you even find the c value, put those blank spaces in there so you know exactly where they're going to go. Next, we can factor the part that we have, which means it's going to be two sets of parentheses equal to something else. So you've got x and x. Remember the square root of my c value, so square root of 100 is 10. So that's going to go in there for both of those spaces. The middle sign is going to be our sign in the middle. So now this is really x plus 10 quantity squared because there's two of them. For the other side of the equation, though, we still have all this. So 100 plus 15 is 115. And that's what I'm going to put right there because that just carries down. So there's our final answer, and it looks just like we did up here in number 5, except we just had these extra steps at the beginning where we had to move this 15 over before we could see the setup like we did for number 5. All right, so what I want you to do is check to see if this trinomial that we were given is a perfect square trinomial. So I want you to do that first. All right, so you should have taken the square root of 36, which is 6. If we multiply that by 2, we get 12, which is not equal to our b value, so it's not a perfect square trinomial. Remember, this just means that we can't go directly to the factoring. We have to move this constant to the other side. So if we move this 36 to the other side, it becomes x squared minus 16x, or leave a blank space. And if we move it, we have to subtract it over. So make sure you're changing that sign on the other side. And then fill in 2 little blank spaces before you find what the c value is. So now our new c value is going to go in those 2 new blank spaces. So I want you now to find what is the new c value going to be. All right, so you should have taken negative 16 divided by 2, which is negative 8. Square it, you get a positive 64. So 64 should be your new c value. Next, we can factor this left-hand side now. So that means our square root of 64 is back to our 8, so that's our number that's going in there. The sign, remember, is always the middle one, so those are both minus 8. So that means that this is x minus 8 quantity squared for the left-hand side. So the right side, remember, we just need to combine those together, and we get a positive 28, and then that just carries down again, and there is our final answer.